Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Rinaldi, Director of Studies and Policies at FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and I'm very glad to welcome you this afternoon. I will be your host for the next hour of discussion in this hopefully instructive webinar on a very important topic that is essentially the changing geopolitics of energy and of the just transition. Today's webinar, run by FEPS in collaboration with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Just Climate Center, will actually focus on the Russia-Ukraine war and the inflection point for sustainable energy transitions. We are running this workshop because exactly today we have been publishing and launching in the debate one policy brief by Caroline Kuzemko. I have it here with me, exactly on the topic, which you can find on the website of the organization. So we basically want to have the possibility of listening to the input by Caroline Kuzemko. She's a reader in international political economy at Warwick University, where she's also the co-lead of the Energy Global Research Priorities. She's literally one of the greatest European experts in the geopolitics of energy, and she will base her presentation largely on the paper she just published. But we're also happy to have the inputs from a very political viewpoint by Malik Ben Achour. Thanks for joining. Malik is a member of the Belgian Chamber of Representatives, and I would say one of the Belgian champions of the eco-socialism. So thanks a lot for joining us. He's a member of the Parti Socialiste Belge. You also have a background in philosophy, and you studied the Nietzsche at length, for which we respect you. We respect you a lot, but most importantly, you have also digged into European affairs. And you are now politically, you have your hands in the Committee for International Cooperation, Climate and Energy, and also Budget and Finance. So you are in the committees that we consider extremely relevant for this difficult task that we have asked Caroline to untangle, because we were trying to understand what are the implications for the transformation of the energy market for the climate transitions after the war in Ukraine. Of course, it is clear that the European Union had made huge steps in the direction of pushing for a new energy mix, thanks to the European Green Deal, with decarbonization and favoring renewable energy. But then this big push for energy security is maybe upsetting a little bit this positive trend that was going on in Europe. Caroline, I leave you the floor immediately. You have about 15 minutes for your presentation. I know that you have slides to present. I immediately asked to all those that follow us to file their questions on the Zoom chat, so that I can redirect them after the interventions to our speakers. Caroline, you have the floor. What are the implications of the war in Ukraine for the sustainability of our energy mix?
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Okay, so I'm really just going to give you a sneak preview, I guess, as it were, of the policy brief that I've written for FEPS on this question of the Russia-Ukraine war, and really thinking about it in relation to it being an inflection point for sustainable energy transitions, both for Europe, actually, but also for the rest of the world. So on the first slide, I'm just going to think about the background a bit here before we start talking about implications. And of course, the invasion by Russia of the Ukraine has had wide-reaching implications for energy markets, energy affordability, energy security across all of Europe, but really actually has had knock-on effects on the rest of the world. Now, running into this, energy prices had already been high. And that was like from the end of 2021, which was much more in relation to global economies rebounding after COVID and lockdowns, etc. But that was already a really difficult affordability situation. And then, of course, in February, there was the invasion, and then the decision very soon thereafter by the EU to phase out imports of Russian fossil fuels. Now, this is a big deal. This is a very large problem for the EU to face into, because 40% of their gas imports came through pipelines from Russia. And so it has, of course, necessitated this considerable restructuring of energy policy, which is what I'm really going to be talking about today. And then sort of almost as a self-fulfilling prophecy, I suppose, in some ways, Russia then also started reducing significantly gas pipeline throughput into Europe. Nord Stream was closed, and thereafter there was also some sabotage on Nord Stream. And so taken together, the sort of energy security issues, affordability issues are, I think, a really interesting reminder of this really multi-dimensional social nature and actually importance of energy policy and getting it right. And it's sort of hard enough already to balance energy security issues at times like this with energy equity and affordability issues. But of course, at the same time, Europe is very much also a global leader in a self-professed manner, but also viewed by the rest of the world in terms of reducing GHG emissions. And it often does this by example. And the really interesting thing about the EU was that its energy policy was increasingly trying to move towards considerations of justice and equity in the sustainable energy transition. And so it's actually a really interesting moment in time to try and consider what the implications for sustainable energy are from this refocus on energy security. So this slide is about what Europe, the EU in particular, but also there's various changes happening at all member state levels as well. But really just thinking in this slide about security. So the Repower EU package and the various other measures that have followed on from that essentially have been reframing energy policy around delivering an end to dependence on Russian fossil fuel imports. And of course, this theoretically might suggest less of an emphasis on other energy policy goals like reducing GHG emissions and energy equity. And in the past, during energy security crises, that has happened. There has been a reduction in emphasis on sustainability. But interestingly, what's happening this time around is it's more of a mix. So on the one hand, the EU is trying to diversify gas suppliers. This has led to what some people are calling a global scramble for gas, mainly focused around trying to get into global LNG markets. The EU has sought to increase its joint storage of gas, to act with solidarity. And then the two other pillars of the strategy have been around reducing demand and accelerating renewables, particularly also viewing renewables as more homegrown in Europe, thereby having the ability to boost independence and maybe then also energy security. But I suppose we should always bear in mind the geography of this, because renewables rely on manufacturing processes, for example, making solar panels, producing blades for wind turbines, etc. And these in turn are dependent on critical materials. and they are only found in fixed locations around the world. So thus far, these changes in policy have led to, I would say, a more secure energy situation when we're thinking about 2022. So there had been a lot of worry about this year, and there have been some achievements. By November, EU storage levels were at 95%. By September, EU gas imports from Russia were down to 9%. From that initial 45% number, which is a big decrease. And then there are estimates now for fourth quarter of this year of a 20% reduction in gas demand, mainly from buildings and industry sectors, not so much from the power sector. And other things that have been happening is that there's been increased imports from Norway and the UK along the gas pipeline routes. But really the sort of big change that we've been talking about a lot is the new LNG deals that are being signed with the USA, with Qatar, with Algeria. So as I've mentioned, the energy security fears seem to have lessened a bit for this year, albeit of course now we are in a cold snap, so that may change things a bit. And it seems to be more 2023 and 2024 that we are concerned about. And that's partly because global gas supplies don't rebalance after COVID, the demand increase in the post-COVID environment for another couple of years. China, for COVID-associated reasons, has had lower gas demand, and it's now lowering some of its COVID restrictions. So there may be a rebound in gas demand from China. And so there are concerns that prices may remain at least volatile, if not high, for the next year or so. And then the other interesting thing, to come back to critical materials that we've seen, is that with the rebound in the acceleration of build out of solar and wind, critical material supply chains, also for other reasons, have been under pressure. And lithium ion battery prices are actually up in 2022, which is very slightly, but still it's the first upward trend in a very long time. So let's move on to look at GHG emissions reduction and what the implications have been of the energy policy changes so far. Now, of course, when we're talking about GHG emissions reductions, we need to remember that energy is 75% of man-made GHG emissions. So sustainable energy transitions are incredibly important things to get right. And on the one hand, Repower EU has got this significant intention to accelerate clean energy. For example, the 2030 target for renewables, it's proposed that that goes up to 45% of energy, which is ambitious. There's considerable shift in support for electrification of heat pumps in specific, support for solar, for wind, hydrogen, nuclear. And then on the energy efficiency or demand reduction side, which is just as important, which I will come back to talk more about later, there's the proposal to raise the 2030 Energy Efficiency Directive target to 13%, but arguably, from my point of view, but also there's been quite a lot of critique on this, without sufficient policies or extra EU level investment in energy efficiency. But the policy that is interesting, I think, in terms not only of GHG emissions reduction, but also security and equity, actually, is the agreement now that there will be a mandatory 5% reduction in peak electricity demand between December and March of next year. So that's kind of on the relatively more positive side, but sustainable energy transitions have this harder, politically more difficult aspect to them, which is phasing out fossil fuels. And here we see a more mixed picture. So on the gas front, I guess the jury is out. There is new infrastructure being built so that Europe can import LNG. It hasn't been a huge importer LNG in the past because it's had its pipeline gas from Russia. Gas has also now been put into the EU green taxonomy for investment. So that is making some market commentators worry about a slightly longer lock-in of gas usage than might otherwise have happened. But then on the other side, maybe this will turn out to be stranded assets. Certainly the EU estimates that its short to medium term, or particularly medium term, gas demand will be lower as a result of these policies. And commentators like the International Energy Agency are talking about the golden age of gas being now over. But if we think of this sort of step back out of Europe and take a more global view of this, the new gas deals being signed, some of them are long-term contracts. And that flies very much in the face of UNFCCC drive, and also obviously the EU's role within that drive for phasing out fossil fuels. There's a bit of a contrast here. And I guess this speaks to this relative emphasis on security over environmental goals, but of course in other parts of the world that's seen as a hypocritical move. And then moving on to coal, there has been various countries within the EU, but across the wider Europe, obviously the UK being one of them, talking about emergency restarts of coal-fired electricity. And I mean, that may or may not result in higher emissions than otherwise, but it has certainly led to questions in other parts of the world about the EU as a climate leader by example. And of course, the global scramble for gas, the EU tapping into LNG markets that it wasn't really part of before, has meant that LNG has been less available for other parts of the world. So there has been more burning of coal elsewhere too. Okay, so let's think now a little bit more about energy equity. And I'm going to do this in two ways. I'm going to think about energy equity within the EU, and then I'm going to think about it on a more global basis. So within the EU, I mean, the EU has really been in a bit of a rock and a hard place here. So on the one hand, it wants to reduce Russian imports, but on the other hand, and that in and itself, of course, puts upward pressure on prices. But LNG, which it's now buying, is more expensive than natural gas. So there's like twin impacts on prices there. And so we're in this environment now where energy affordability, for very good reasons, has become far more visible. Also energy company profits becoming politically more visible, which I think is quite an interesting moment. And there has been a response, a wide range of EU level and member state level responses, more on the sort of social policy side, but explicitly looking to redistribute energy profits towards citizens. Some energy companies are making a lot of money. So there's the solidarity contribution from oil and gas firms, there's the cap on revenues from low cost electricity. And now the proposed market correction mechanism, which is creating quite a few shockwaves within responses from energy market actors. And it is an interesting moment in time because it seems that whether this is going to be just crisis oriented or actually longer term, there's a clear stepping in of the state into energy markets, which I find interesting. In terms of long-term solutions, though, in relation to the affordability of energy and making vulnerable citizens and households less exposed to these volatile gas and electricity prices, the long-term solution is energy efficiency. And so there's been some of that going on at various member state levels, but I think that's something that the EU could do more on, and I'll come back to that. Internationally, when we're thinking about equity, just a few points. The EU has placed itself in direct competition with, in particular, various Southeast Asian countries for LNG. This has resulted in higher global prices, a lack of access to LNG. I mean, I don't know if you've read in various media reports, the sort of reports of tankers of LNG that had been heading to Southeast Asia, and then EU were offering nicer prices and tankers turning around and heading towards the EU. And this is serious for those countries. We've seen an energy crisis in Pakistan, we've seen it in Sri Lanka and various other countries. Now, of course, this reduction in global energy equity does have implications for energy and climate diplomacy when you're face to face with other parts of the world and trying to get them to agree with what you would like to see done. And then there's another aspect of this which is interesting, which is the UK and Norway. They've stepped in and increased production, particularly of gas, to sort of fill these sort of short-term gaps. But they're also now talking about considerable increased extraction of gas and oil, which clearly goes against notions of equitable access to remaining carbon budgets for the global south, and that being something that the global north should not be doing. So lastly, ideas for policymakers. The attention now is increasingly on 2023, and as the EU looks towards that, perhaps a refocus on emissions reduction and equitable and just transitions would be a good starting point to make this an inflection point, which is more about sustainability in this sort of broader kind of sense. You know, to me, but this is something that I'm sort of seeing from a lot of the people interested in sustainable energy transitions, is that there needs to be a real kick start to the demand side focus of the sustainable transition. So it shouldn't just be about reducing GHG emissions from supply, because this is a much more equitable route to reducing GHG emissions. So that would be on the demand side, response side, maybe extending this reduction in peak electricity demand beyond March of next year. On energy efficiency, perhaps more clearer, larger EU funding for energy efficiency, maybe setting targets for member states. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do that unless you were making money available for it. And this is something that's not so often talked about, but the need for skills and training in energy efficiency, in heat pumps, in other forms of clean energy businesses and models is really, I think, stark across Europe. So more funding and coordination around that would be good to see. And of course, there is this acceleration now of renewable energy, which is great on many fronts. And there is a push towards electrification, and this will need more batteries. So in order to avoid further pressures on critical material supply chains, it would be great to see more investment in research into and dissemination of battery recycling and repurposing techniques. Then just it would be nice to see a refocus back within the EU on fossil fuel phase out. I mean, clearly in an emergency situation, the focus has been on how to secure energy security by diversifying gas supplies, but it would be nice to see an EU-wide commitment to fossil fuel, a timeline, a phase out, and a coordination mechanism. And then lastly, a refocus on international diplomacy, particularly around loss and damage, and working with the Global South, not on trying to access gas supplies, but on investment in and an enabling of clean energy. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Caroline, that was very instructive. Thanks a lot for providing us with this nice overview touching on not only the description of the situation, but also sketching potential way forward. You have a session with ideas for policymakers, so actually that gives me the chance to revert directly to Malik, member of parliament here in Belgium. The challenges are very difficult, I suppose. There's many objectives to address at the same time. But maybe my question, while asking you for a comment to the paper and the presentation, is actually how to continue steering the ecological transition in this context in which energy security is important, but also energy poverty, so that we have to also protect households from this increase in energy costs. Malik, you have the floor.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for the invitation. And And thank you, Caroline, for the very factual and interesting speech. I would note that nothing has been really said about the market design of energy market in Europe. I think it's an interesting topic to work on, because actually we are facing also a collapse of this market design based on a liberal paradigm. But the question I've been asked is, does war in Ukraine accelerate the transition? And I would say, beyond the provocative side of the question, I would directly say no. No, the war does not accelerate the transition to climate change, or not really, actually. And as I received 5 minutes to answer this question, I will try to put at side of your reflection two provocative elements, two very political elements. Maybe a little bit caricatural, but sometimes, you know, it can be a powerful tool to think and to act in the right way. So please don't blame me for that. I do it on purpose. But first of all, we must not lose sight of the fact that the climate transition will not succeed against the people. The war has led us to an explosion in prices that is literally unsustainable for families and SMEs. I think this is a problem for the long-term support of the population for the Ukrainian cause, and it's also a problem for the support of the population to the cause of transition. A just and fair transition is a transition in which the burden falls primarily on the richest. Here, however, it's the poorest and the workers who suffer the most from the consequences of inflation, and that is a huge problem, I think. Secondly, I want to refer to a very interesting article published on the site Reporter a few days ago. And this article shows how Ukraine's energy reserves, which are huge and colossal, are the major stake in the war. The Ukrainian subsoil conceals deposits with an estimated value of $7,500 billion. Iron, graphite, manganese, titanium, shale gas. There are 8,700 metal deposits who have been identified. And as far as gas is concerned, Ukraine has the largest reserve in Europe after Russia. It seems, therefore, that war does not accelerate the transition, but allows two things. One, to control the resources necessary for the transition, for example, in terms of battery or of battery development, sorry. So the question is, who will control those resources necessary for transition, Europe and Western world, or Russia? And two, to allow the multinationals of the fossil fuel sector to increase their potential in a business as usual logic. I know this is a little bit provocative, a little bit caricatural, but the sustainability of transition to climate change on families, on workers, on SMEs is, for me, essential. And secondly, we cannot lose sight the geopolitics of energy in the war, which is not a war on the way to transition, but a war to have hands on fossil energy in the business as usual logic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Malik, also for having introduced us with a new, if you want, relevant aspect for the geopolitics of this war and the relevant resources that Ukraine possesses for economic development, but also for the ecological transition. We have started to receive questions online. I start with two, and I'll give the floor back to the two of you for commenting and responding the way you can to these questions. The first one comes from Nick, that is actually asking about the comparison in terms of quality and quality somehow in how bad the two type of energies are between the LNG fracked gas that we can get from the US and instead the gas that we get from Russia. So is there any improvement in moving from one to the other for what concerned sustainable energy transition or not? And connected to this, the issue is, okay, if we go for a solution that is, I would say, temporary with the US and with the LNG, are we then going to become dependent from these new solutions, or we can phase out from that in a relatively easy way? So one issue, if you want, on this issue on the security of energy, so of energy supply, with a comparison between the US and Russian gas. The other question is going instead in the direction of asking a couple of points more from you on the demand reduction. So with this issue of sobriety that is coming about, Caroline, you discussed in your presentation and in your paper the measures that have already been taken, and this is one of the other aspects, perhaps connected with what Malik mentioned. That of course there is a somehow aspects of positive change, so that everybody understand that we should move to a different consumption pattern. And live lives that are more in line with the boundaries that our planet forces us to consider. But at the same time, we don't want to lose the support of the people, of the households. We don't want to show that they have to make the sacrifice first. And that will be the way in which we address the crisis. So up to which point we can push on sobriety and demand reduction, and up to which point that can only be somehow maybe one of the adaptation that we have to consider, but doesn't really respond to the solution. So these two, if you want, broad questions, and I revert maybe first to Caroline and then back to Malik.
Great, interesting questions, and Malik, thank you for your response. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a million miles away from Malik on all of this. I fundamentally believe that a sustainable energy transition can only be sustainable if it delivers those core goals of energy equity, social justice, and GHG emissions, of course, and resilient energy markets, or not markets, but access to energy at affordable prices. And so, and this is especially because if you think about what needs to be done and the politics of it, GHG emissions reduction, which is a climate mitigation policy, it has to stay on policy agendas at or near the top of policy agendas for about 30 years for this to happen. So there's going to be a long time scale within which it's possible for climate change to fall off political agendas. And if you do not pursue a transition which is just and equitable, then it's very likely that you will easily give excuses for it to come off the political agenda. So I completely and utterly agree. And so that sort of takes me on to thinking about the demand side of this. And I'm going to mention energy efficiency first, because energy efficiency is where you get the best value, but widest range of co-benefits for one policy. So if you make sure that those who are in the vulnerable end of the energy market, if you ensure that their homes are properly insulated, and preferably maybe with some solar panels on top and smart meters installed, etc., it leaves them so much less vulnerable to these spikes in energy prices that we are going to see, I think, because as you're phasing out fossil fuels, you know, investment patterns are going to start getting a bit odd in gas. And so you will see spiking and volatile prices. And the way to really protect households is to make sure that they have to buy as little gas as possible. And of course, the other way to do this is to get off gas and get onto heat pumps in particular. But number one step is always to make sure that homes are insulated. But there are other things that can be done with demand side response. And this is why I think that this EU's move, and I have to say it did surprise me, to cap peak electricity demand is so interesting, because this is the first time I think that we've really seen a significant area of the world try this so it's almost like a policy experiment in some ways. But if they manage to do it, it shows that it is possible. And if you reduce peak electricity demand, you start to reduce the cost of the system as a whole, because you don't have to produce so much electricity. And it's that supply of electricity that's more expensive. So I would fully agree that the demand side is the way for more secure, more affordable and lower emissions energy systems. And then there was a question about this USA LNG versus Russian natural gas. And LNG, full stop, I think pretty much wherever it comes from, it's been through more processes. So it is more expensive. And it's also less environmentally positive. So LNG is, however, the only option that the EU seems to have at the moment because of the geography of where the EU is. It's been fed by these pipelines, it's been dependent on those pipelines, and it has had to seek gas from elsewhere, and that's the global market in LNG. So, you know, if I was there with a sort of magic pen able to rewrite EU policy, I would be putting in place a long-term plan to get off LNG. And clearly the way to do that is through demand reduction and through decarbonising or reducing the GHG emissions, you know, heat pumps, renewables, hydrogen, other forms of storage, smarter grids, all the things that need to be done.
Thank you, Caroline. We go to Malik.
Thank you. Caroline has given a lot of answers to the question that has been asked. Maybe can I ask you, Caroline, another question? You talk about demand cap. What about prices cap? You think it could be a solution to the crisis we are going through, considering the fact that to impose a cap price involved to it means that we have to rethink the design of this liberal market of energy in Europe. And I see this is a difficult step for many countries, many governments, for the commissions. It's difficult to think out of the box, out of this liberal market box. So what do you think? We know that at least 15 countries, 15 governments have asked the Commission to set this cap price. What is your analysis on this question, on this issue? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think that the price cap will be difficult to implement, partly because I know what the EU are hearing is huge backlash from energy companies, particularly gas firms, of course. And there are all sorts of arguments from their side about the ways in which it then changes market behaviours. And their argument is a bit, well, if you want the markets to deliver, you'll have to allow the markets to do what they do. So, you know, prices go up when supply is low, but then that causes more supply to be built, etc., and then markets rebalance. So I know that they're facing into a lot of opposition on this, and it will be difficult. And I think it will come down to how it's designed and the level at which the price cap is put in. And I find it a bit difficult to judge whether or not they will go ahead with that. But it's a really interesting, I mean, I am interested in the question of states and markets, and that's partly why I'm thinking about this as an inflection point, because if you look across energy policy, which is sort of these sort of 3 or potentially 4 core energy policy goals, we're now in a situation in at the EU level, but also very many member state levels, where the state is stepping in to act. It is intervening in markets. I mean, if you're redistributing profits from energy companies towards citizens, you are intervening in markets. There's an intervention in markets in order to change planning rules so that you can get more onshore wind and solar. I mean, there are a lot of things that are going on at the moment. So there's no point pretending that the state does not have a role to play at the moment. It does. And I think what I would like to see is just sort of maybe a clearer recognition of that, and maybe an embracing of it, just to think through how it can be done to the optimal effect. It doesn't mean that the state has to lead in energy policy for the next 50 years as a forever thing, but there are times when you need to intervene, and then there are times when maybe you can step back a bit. And I think now is clearly a time when the state is intervening in order to deliver these energy policy goals.
Allow me, Caroline, to step in there with a comment on the role of the EU. I was wondering, because there has been a lot of discussion here in Brussels about the dynamic pricing, and as well of the common purchase. And there is under discussion some proposal on how on the way to buy together gas, at least some little percentages of the gas. That would be certainly one step in the right direction, because one thing that we have to avoid is that European member states compete with each other for the purchase of gas and inflating the price. This is, the very first thing that the European coordination and political collaboration should avoid. Very first. Very first thing. The other issue that I'd like to stress is that one of the arguments that we hear a lot here in Brussels is that we need to allow these energy companies to have profits, and there are literally a lot of profits and dividends being shared at the moment, because we need to maintain the incentive for them to invest in renewables. And my point is, okay, but the vast majority of profits are not coming from renewables. We need to be able, from a policy viewpoint, to say that profits are there, can be there in the medium to long term, but not on gas and brown energy. profits are there if there is an investment either in energy communities or in sustainable energy. So maybe a conditionality or a taxation or a price that is impacting differently somehow the brown and the sustainable energy. Investment, room for investment, yes, but what we see now is really excessive profits, and if there are so big dividends, it means that the money is not reinvested in infrastructure. So the point I think remain, and we should perhaps here in Brussels not buy so easily the arguments of some of the energy corporations. So comments on these are very welcome to both of you, but I also would like to flag one question that is connected to this from Martina, that is asking a very simple, but from my viewpoint, very political question. Who is going to control the energy resources in the incoming decades? And of course, it goes exactly at the core of the discussion that we were doing. Partly the resources in Ukraine, but also the energy production and the role of the state and the market. But it allows me to also open up this issue of the transformation of the, if you want, electricity and energy market towards the decentralization. So this issue of the energy communities that perhaps can empower SMEs and citizens, households, to be more and more seen as producers as well. So rather than only consumers. Do we have a chance to empower communities in this energy transition? Does it make sense? How to do it? That's a question that I would like to have a couple of inputs from the two of you, if you can. And then we have, after that, another important question on Ukraine to conclude our talk. If you have inputs.
Maybe very quickly and very shortly. I'm very interested with the over profits topic. We are looking to the companies over profits, and it's legitimate. And in Belgium, we have decided to go further than the cap of 180 fixed by European Commission. In Belgium, we have put this cap at 130, as you know. So we want to be, ambitious on this question. But about over profits, I would say two things. First, the other way to see this topic is to ask this question. We can go and take those over profits in the company's pockets, and I have no problems with that. But there is also another way to act, is to avoid those over profits to be made, actually. And this is the question of price cap. This is the question of rules and regulations on the market. This is my first point. Second point, why don't we look at the over profits made by states? For example, Norway. Norway is now like an emirate. It goes richer and richer and richer. In August, last August, l'excédent budgétaire in English, I don't know the word, over profit of the state. In August, it was I think $20 billion, 20 billions in 1 month. Norway is a neighbor. Norway is a European country. It sells us gas. Why don't we go faster on negotiations with Norway to, you know, we are friends, and it goes the same way with United States. We are friends and neighbor. We are friends in war. Why don't you go on friend prices? If we are friend in the war, why can't you give us, you know, prix d'amis, we say in French.
Facilitated price, yes.
Yeah. So
at least not at the market. At least not at the market level.
Absolutely. This is an exceptional situation we are going through. So we can, you know, put the market in parentheses and, you know, set prices friends to friends, because for now it's unsustainable for our people. So I don't understand why the Commission doesn't go faster on this issue of negotiation with friends countries like the US or Norway, for example.
Thanks, Malik. Caroline.
Yes, I imagine that if the EU approached Norway or US with a friendship price proposal, I'm not sure they'd get very far. There's sort of a very long history of having energy resources and having the economic and the political power that goes with those kinds of things. And if you look at Norway, I mean, the culture of oil and gas in Norway is that the welfare system is built upon those riches, and there's a very sort of different kind of mentality there. And sort of meanwhile, of course, they're decarbonizing their own economy, but then they're sort of busy exporting their emissions, as it were, abroad. And even Biden, I guess, with his Inflation Reduction Act, he has a very friendly approach towards exporting shale gas emissions from the US around the rest of the world. So I wonder if their ears would be closed to that. I mean, lovely as it would be. But in terms of the politics of oil and gas companies making money, I think this is an interesting one. So oil and gas companies and electric utility companies have been influential over government decision-making at the EU and member state level for a long time now. And that is because we are all dependent on energy. And it is because they were the ones who were keeping the lights on, as it were. So they've always been able in a crisis situation to say, well, if you want the lights to stay on, don't mess with our markets, don't mess with our profits. But I think that with the increase in not popularity, but the increase in awareness and the increase in political support for climate change, sustainable energy, decarbonisation amongst populations across Europe now, plus this awareness now of the amount of money that oil and gas companies are making with the vulnerabilities that are absolutely clear that you're seeing across populations. I think that role of oil and gas and electric utility companies has been politicized in a way that it hasn't for a very long time. So I do think that is politically very interesting. And then in terms of who controls energy resources, well, it's like a really interesting question, isn't it? But energy resources are going to change fundamentally. And so it's no longer going to be as much about the sort of fixed and finite fossil fuels, because pretty much every country in the world, more or less, has got access to renewable sources, primary sources of energy. More sun in some parts of the world, more wind in other parts of the world. In the future, maybe also, you know, wave, tidal, etc., etc. So this means that this interrelationship and this question of who controls energy is going to change dramatically. And it may become more focused on this question of critical materials, and certainly it's already becoming focused on that. But the way to get around that definitely is, as I sort of mentioned in the presentation, to really focus on questions of circular economy and questions of how to recycle and repurpose all of those manufactured products that sort of sit beside having renewable energy systems, if you really sort of want to think about how to reduce those kinds of dependencies that we've had in the past. And of course, this question of whether we're going to have a decentralized, consumer-involved, prosumer energy system also depends upon political decisions, doesn't it? And this idea that it's going to be the big energy companies that are going to be the ones who are going to invest in our renewable future is very different from the idea that this is going to be much more community-based and localized profits and localized benefits from having renewables, which you can do because they can be produced at small scale. So, I mean, that's another set of political decisions that are very interesting. And I thought, my impression was, particularly with the Clean Energy for All, but also Fit for 55, there were various sections in there that were definitely leaning towards more support for community energy. Obviously less so now, but that seemed to be the direction it was heading in.
Thanks, Caroline. I think that a good way to conclude this discussion on the Russia-Ukraine war and the inflection point for sustainable energy transition is to understand and check whether this inflection point can be a positive thing in the long term, for not only for the sustainability of the energy market, but also for Ukraine. So if the question goes to the way in which we can drive and steer the reconstruction of Ukraine, and thanks Anna for having put it in a much better way than I can report now in this talk. But essentially, we have mentioned Ukraine for the raw material that they have, but they also are already able to produce heat pumps, solar photovoltaic panels. They are also able to manage and produce wind turbines and other energy efficient materials. So is there a way in which somehow we can help create a success story for sustainable transition in Ukraine, thanks to the reconstruction? The EU has already been active in putting forward joint borrowing to help the reconstruction. Is there any chance that you see, and would you see it as a value, to have Ukraine as a sort of green transition technology hub in the near future? Given that the vast majority of infrastructure have now been destroyed, it makes sense to help reconstruct at the forefront of technology, isn't it? Caroline.
I mean, it makes sense, of course it does. And I think that it will come down to if the EU wants to make decisions about how reconstruction funds are spent. I mean, in the post-war period in Germany, the KfW bank was responsible for a lot of the spending of those monies, and it ended up being a sustainability bank in many respects and responsible for a lot of energy efficiency investment. And so maybe one could think about that kind of model within the Ukraine with specific concentrations on the very broad range of renewable and clean energy manufacturing and installation, etc., that it could be involved in. But I think that would come down to whether or not the EU is prepared to sort of set those kinds of conditions on sort of any funds for reinvestment.
Thanks, Caroline. Maybe a word from you, Malik, as well, on the future of Ukraine and the reconstruction.
Yes, about Anna's questions. I think I'm a little bit pessimistic, considering what I said in the beginning of this discussion. The way, the richness of the Ukraine ground is so huge that you have already Exxon, Shell, Chevron, Eni, they are all there. They are all there in Ukraine, waiting for maybe the end of the war and starting to, to work on those grounds, on those fields. But I'm pessimistic. But on the other way, I'm optimistic, because we have seen in the last 10 years, particularly in Donbass, people fighting against, for example, gas exploitation in their region, in their neighborhood. So I think if we want to transform Ukraine in a huge green transition hub, as Anna said, we have to support the people in the fight. They will fight on the ground for those multinationals not to keep on this old world that we don't want to see anymore. We want to build something new.
Thanks, Malik. I was scared you would finish on a pessimistic note, but thankfully you managed to open up to some optimism at the end. We had about an hour conversation with the two of you, and I'm extremely grateful to Dr. Caroline Kuzemko, reader in international political economy at the University of Warwick, and to Malik Ben Achour, member of the Belgian Chamber of Representatives. Thanks a lot to both of you on behalf of the audience of FEPS, but also of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the Just Climate Center that partnered up with us on this important topic. I have to remember to all of you online that on FEPS website you can find Dr. Kuzemko's policy brief exactly on the ongoing transformation of the sustainable energy transition in the aftermath of the war. And stay tuned, because more activities and more little piece of knowledge or political debates will come up thanks to FEPS and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Thanks a lot and good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Bye, thanks.